The crackling of the fire had settled into a steady, comfortable rhythm, and the only other sound in the cabin was the soft turning of a page. My daughter Margaret sat cross-legged on the rug near the hearth, her blonde hair catching the amber light, her small finger tracing the illustrations of some picture book she'd already read 4 times that weekend. I leaned back in the wooden chair, a mug of coffee warming my palms, and exhaled. This was exactly the kind of quiet we had driven 3 hours into the forest to find. Then something shattered it. At first I convinced myself it was a branch, one of those dead pine limbs that the wind occasionally drags against the exterior wall like a bony finger. But the sound came again, and this time it was lower, more deliberate. A rhythmic, dragging scrape against the base of the front door, followed by something I couldn't immediately name. A low, almost inaudible whine that seemed to carry more weight than any sound that small should. Margaret looked up from her book. Her wide blue eyes found mine across the room. I set my mug down slowly. The scraping came a third time, heavier now, laced with urgency, as though whatever was on the other side of that door had used up most of what it had just to reach it. I crossed the room in silence, Margaret already on her feet behind me, small fingers curling into the back of my green flannel shirt. I placed my hand on the door handle and paused, listening. The forest beyond our cabin walls was dark and vast and ancient, and it was not in the habit of sending visitors. I opened the door. The porch light flooded the wooden planks outside, and for a moment my mind simply refused to process what it was seeing. Standing on the deck, just standing there, as if she had been waiting for exactly this, was one of the largest huskies I had ever laid eyes on. Her coat was a tapestry of silver, black, and storm cloud gray, matted along her left flank with something dark and dried. Her pale blue eyes caught the light and held it, and in them was an expression so coherent, so deliberately directed at me, that it stopped the breath in my chest. But it was what she carried in her jaws that broke me open entirely. Held with the most extraordinary gentleness, the way a mother holds the one thing she cannot afford to lose, was a puppy, tiny, limp, its small body suspended between the husky's teeth, dangling in the cold night air with the terrible stillness of something hovering right at the edge of gone. My first instinct was to step back. I am not a man who frightens easily, but a wild, injured animal on your threshold, in the dark, is not a situation that logic handles well in the first half-second. My hand tightened on the doorframe. Margaret pressed closer behind me. But the husky did not growl. She did not bare her teeth or lower her head in threat. She simply stood there and looked at me, and the looking was the thing. It was not the blank stare of an animal caught in headlights. It was a gaze with a request inside it, direct and exhausted and absolute, as though she had run out of every other option the world had offered her, and this door, this stranger, this light in the dark forest was the very last one. She whined again, barely audible, barely more than a breath shaped into sound, and the puppy's small leg twitched once. Margaret stepped around me. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "She needs us." I looked at my 7-year-old daughter, standing in the doorframe in her blue top and little blue sneakers, her eyes not frightened at all, only open and certain in the way that children sometimes are when adults have forgotten how to be. And I stepped aside. Margaret crouched down, one small hand extended toward the husky, palm up, fingers loose, the way I'd taught her, and waited. The husky studied her, 1 second, 2, then she stepped forward and crossed the threshold. She walked directly to the braided rug in front of the fireplace as though she knew it was there, lowered her great head with immense care, and set the puppy down. Then she straightened, looked at us, and did not move again. Her whole body radiated a single, wordless imperative: do something, please. I closed the door and came to kneel beside them, and that's when I caught it, beneath the smell of pine resin and cold night air and wet fur, the thin, metallic thread of blood. I ran my eyes along the husky's body and found it, her right forepaw held slightly elevated, the fur around it matted into stiff black ridges. I reached toward her slowly, speaking in a low, even voice, and she turned her head to watch my hand approach. She didn't pull away. She held perfectly still as my fingers parted the fur and exposed the wound beneath, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The cut was deep and ragged, the skin torn not cleanly, but in the brutal, irregular pattern I recognized immediately. I had grown up near these woods. I had reported these before. A trap. She had been caught in a poacher's trap, had wrenched herself free through sheer desperation, leaving flesh behind in the process, and had then, with a damaged leg and no way to hunt, managed to find her puppy and carry it through miles of dark forest to the only lit window she could find. I sat back on my heels and looked at her, this battered, extraordinary animal who had crossed the impossible distance between her world and mine on nothing but the will to save something smaller than herself, and felt the familiar, quiet weight of a decision that didn't need any deliberation at all. "Maggie," I said, already moving toward the supply cabinet, "get the blanket off the couch, wrap the puppy, keep it close to the fire." "Is she going to be okay?" Margaret asked, already pulling the blanket free, already moving toward the puppy with a focus and a tenderness that made my throat tighten. "Both of them are," I said. I was going to make sure of it. Margaret had always been the kind of child who stopped for worms on wet pavement. She would crouch over them with the gravity of a surgeon, study the situation, and then relocate every last one to the grass with the patience of someone who understood, even at 7, that size had nothing to do with worth. I used to watch her from the kitchen window on rainy mornings and feel something I didn't have a precise word for, a mixture of pride and wonder, and the quiet, unsettling recognition that my daughter was, in certain fundamental ways, already wiser than me. I thought about those worms as she stepped around me into the doorway. The husky was still watching us from the porch, her pale eyes moving between my face and Margaret's with an intelligence that felt almost uncomfortable to meet directly. The puppy lay motionless. The night air pressing in from the treeline carried the mineral sharpness of pine sap and the season's first deep cold, and the porch light threw long shadows across the wooden planks, making the whole scene look like something painted rather than real, too stark, too significant, too perfectly composed to be accidental. But Margaret did not hesitate. She lowered herself to one knee on the cabin floor, her small body framed by the doorway, and extended her hand the way I had taught her, palm upward, loose, open, the universal language of "I mean you no harm." It was the gesture of someone offering something without demanding anything in return, and watching my 7-year-old perform it with such unself-conscious precision made me realize she hadn't learned it from me. Not really. She had learned it from something older and deeper than instruction. The husky's nostrils flared. She read Margaret the way animals read the things that matter most, not by words or appearance, but by the quality of stillness a person carries. Margaret had the right kind. She waited without fidgeting, without the anxious energy that animals distrust before they can name the reason. She simply held the space open and let the dog decide. A long moment passed. The fire crackled behind us. An owl called once from somewhere deep in the pines and went silent. Then the husky stepped forward. She crossed the threshold slowly, each movement deliberate, the injured forepaw barely grazing the planks as she compensated her weight across the other 3 legs. Up close, she was even larger than she'd appeared from a distance. Her shoulders reached nearly to Margaret's chin, and the wear of whatever ordeal had brought her here was written into every line of her body. Her fur was tangled with burrs and dried mud along her underbelly, and the smell of her was the forest itself. Bark and cold water and the darker, iron-edged scent I had already identified and filed away to deal with in a moment. She stopped directly in front of Margaret. For a breath, neither of them moved. My daughter looked up into those glacier-pale eyes, and the dog looked down. And something passed between them that I am not sure I have the language for even now. An agreement, maybe, a mutual recognition of seriousness. Then the husky lowered her great head and pressed her nose briefly, gently, against Margaret's open palm, and Margaret exhaled like she'd been holding that breath since the scratching began. "Good girl," she whispered. "You're safe now, we've got you." The dog straightened, turned, and walked directly to the braided rug in front of the fireplace, as though she had always known it was there. She lowered her head with extraordinary care and set the puppy down, that terrible, tender placement, The way she released it so gradually it barely disturbed the air. And then she stepped back and looked at us with an expectation so focused it was almost pressure. I was already moving. I pulled the throw blanket from the couch and brought it to Margaret, who had followed the dog to the fireside and was already crouching over the puppy with both hands hovering, wanting to touch it, uncertain if she should. The little body was so small it barely registered as substantial, a dark, soft bundle no larger than a winter boot, its chest moving in shallow, irregular flickers that were the only evidence it was still on the right side of the line. "Wrap him," I said, "tight but gentle, like you're tucking him in." She did it without question, folding the blanket around the puppy in careful layers, her small fingers working with a focus I recognized as the same one she brought to her worm rescues, that complete, unperformed commitment to the task at hand. When she finished, she cupped the bundle against her chest and sat down cross-legged beside the fire, rocking almost imperceptibly, the way she must have seen mothers do, though no one had ever taught her. I turned to the mother dog. She had settled onto the rug beside Margaret, her body bracketing the child like a parenthesis, her eyes tracking every movement I made as I retrieved the first aid kit from the bathroom cabinet. I spoke as I worked, low, even sentences, not so much for her understanding as for the sound of it, the way a calm voice can reach past language and lay itself over fear like a hand on a shoulder. She watched me approach. When I reached for her injured paw, she exhaled sharply through her nose, a sound halfway between a warning and a sigh, but she did not pull away. What the wound told me made my jaw tighten. I had grown up in logging country, in a family that spent enough weekends in forest terrain to know the difference between a cut and a clamp mark. The edges of this injury were not the clean geometry of glass or rock or a fall against bark. They were ragged in a specific way, parallel tiers, spaced with a regularity that only one thing produces. A trap had closed on this leg. And she had pulled herself free from it, through pain I could not begin to measure because the puppy needed her to. I cleaned the wound as carefully as I could with what we had, antiseptic, gauze, the antibiotic ointment I kept stocked, because the nearest town was the better part of an hour's drive, and the forest does not schedule its emergencies. She flinched when the antiseptic met raw tissue, a full-body shudder that she absorbed and held without redirecting into aggression. When I finished wrapping the paw, she did something that tightened my chest considerably. She turned and licked my hand once, slowly, with the rough warmth of her tongue, and then rested her chin on the rug and closed her eyes. Margaret was watching me over the blanketed puppy, her blue eyes solemn and steady in the firelight. "Daddy," she said quietly, "is that how she got hurt? Did someone do that to her on purpose?" I didn't answer right away. The fire shifted, a log settling with a low collapse of sparks. Outside, the forest had gone completely still, the way deep woods do after dark, not empty, but waiting. "I don't know yet, Maggie," I said, and that was the truth for that moment. But something in the shape of the wound, in the cold deliberateness of what I had seen, was already forming into a certainty I wasn't ready to say out loud to a 7-year-old by firelight. What I did know, what that evening had already pressed into me like a brand, was this. The bravest thing I witnessed that night was not the husky crossing miles of dark forest on 3 legs with her puppy in her jaws. It was my daughter dropping to one knee in an open doorway, extending her hand toward the unknown, and holding it there until the frightened thing on the other side decided the world might be safe after all. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is a small hand, held open in the dark, asking nothing, only offering. Before we go any further, if this story is already moving you, you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. We are on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers this month so we can keep bringing you premium stories like this one every single day. If you believe that compassion matters, please subscribe, hit the like button, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And drop your rating in the comments. On a scale of 1 to 10, how are we doing so far? We read every single comment, and your voice genuinely shapes what we create next. Sleep did not come for me that night. I sat in the wooden chair I had dragged close to the fireplace, my coffee long cold on the side table, and watched the rise and fall of 3 chests, the husky's broad ribcage, the puppy's barely there flutter beneath the blanket, and Margaret's slow, trusting rhythm where she had eventually fallen sideways against the dog's flank and drifted off with her hand still resting on the bundled puppy. The mother dog had not moved to dislodge her. She had simply accepted the weight of my daughter against her side, the way a mountain accepts weather, with a stillness that suggested she had always been prepared to hold something. I studied the husky's bandaged paw in the firelight and let my mind work the problem the way I had learned to work problems in the years before cabin weekends and picture books became the rhythm of my life. Methodically, without rushing toward conclusions before the evidence was complete. But the evidence was already speaking clearly enough. The wound pattern had not changed in my assessment since I first cleaned it. If anything, examining it under better light had deepened my certainty. The tears in the tissue were not random. They ran in matched pairs, spaced with mechanical regularity, angled in a way that was consistent with a jaw trap, the kind that hinges at a central pin and closes from both sides simultaneously. The bruising around the wound's perimeter told its own story. She had been held for a period of time before she managed to pull free, long enough for the pressure to bloom purple and green beneath the skin in a wide radius around the punctures. An escape like that from a set trap against that kind of mechanical resistance. It required a force that the body pays for in tissue and nerve, and it required a reason powerful enough to make the payment feel worthwhile. She had a puppy somewhere in those woods, growing cold and weak, and that had been reason enough. I leaned forward in my chair and looked at her. She was awake. I wasn't sure she had fully slept at all, and her pale eyes were on me with that same deliberate focus she had fixed on me since the moment I opened the door. There was a quality to it that I kept returning to throughout the night, the way you return to a word you've read wrong and have to reread until it resolves. She wasn't watching me the way an animal watches a stranger in its space, with the restless, threat-assessing energy of the uncertain. She was watching me the way someone watches a person they have decided, after considerable deliberation, to trust. It was a gaze with history behind it, with the weight of a choice that had cost her something. I reached out slowly and rested my hand on the rug a few inches from her nose. She sniffed once, then pressed the top of her broad head briefly against my palm before settling again. That small gesture, so quiet and so complete, sat in my chest like a stone dropped in still water, sending rings outward in every direction. Someone had put a trap in this forest, had baited it, set it, and left it. And this animal, this mother, this exhausted and extraordinary creature lying on my cabin rug, had been the one to find it in the dark. When the first grey light began to soften the windows, I made a decision. I left a note for Margaret on the kitchen counter, "Back soon, don't open the door, keep them warm," pulled on my jacket and boots, and stepped outside into the pale, cold morning. I am not a tracker by training, but I am a man who has spent enough seasons in forest terrain to read the language of disturbed ground. I picked up the husky's trail without much difficulty. The paw prints in the soft mud at the tree line told the story plainly, the right front impression shallow and dragged where she had been favoring the injured leg, the other three deep and deliberate with the extra effort of compensation. I followed them back into the trees. The forest in early morning is a different country than it is at night. The light comes in at low angles through the canopy, laying pale bars across the undergrowth, and everything is very quiet and very specific. Each branch, each stone, each disruption in the pine needle floor rendered in high detail by the stillness. I walked slowly, reading as I went, and the story the ground told me grew darker with every 50 meters. I found the first trap 11 minutes from the cabin. It was anchored to a birch root with a chain, half concealed beneath a scatter of dead leaves that had been arranged with enough care to suggest someone who had done this before and understood the value of patience. The trap itself was still set, a wide, flat-jawed model heavy-gauge steel, the kind designed to hold something large, something like a husky, something like a wolf, something, I thought, that someone intended to come back for. I stood over it for a long moment without touching it. The spring mechanism was under serious tension, visible even through the leaf cover in the slight crown of the jaws. These were not cheap, improvised devices. They were professional equipment, maintained and deliberately placed, which told me several things simultaneously. Whoever had laid this trap knew the forest, knew the animal populations moving through it, and had been operating here long enough to have selected and prepared multiple sites. Because when I kept walking, following the line of disrupted undergrowth that suggested a deliberate route rather than random placement, I found a second trap 40 meters further in, and 30 meters beyond that, a third. A line of them, systematically spaced, professionally set, running deeper into the forest along a corridor that paralleled the creek bed where animals came to drink. This was not opportunistic poaching. This was infrastructure. Someone had constructed a harvesting operation inside this woodland, and they had been running it long enough to have learned the patterns of the animals that lived here. My mouth had gone dry. I took photographs with my phone, the placement, the construction, the chain anchors, the surrounding terrain, and marked the GPS coordinates of each site before I turned and walked back toward the cabin. The cold morning air felt different on the walk back than it had on the way out. Thinner, somehow, less forgiving. Margaret was awake when I returned, sitting on the rug with the puppy in her lap, attempting to coax a few drops of warm, diluted milk from a small spoon between its lips. She had found the powdered milk in the cabinet without being told, had worked out the dilution on her own, and was now proceeding with the focused patience of someone who had decided the outcome and was simply doing what the outcome required. The husky sat beside her, watching Margaret's hands with an attention so complete it was almost reverent. My daughter looked up when I came through the door, read my face with the accuracy that children have when they have been paying close attention to a parent, and said, "You found something out there." "Yes," I said. I hung up my jacket and sat down on the hearth across from her. I looked at the husky, at her bandaged paw, at the puppy still fighting its fragile fight for life in Margaret's careful hands, and then I looked at my daughter. Someone put traps in the forest, on purpose, to catch animals. Margaret was quiet for a moment. The puppy's small mouth worked at the spoon. Outside, a bird began calling in the pines, one long clear note repeated at intervals as though making a point. "So she didn't just get hurt," Margaret said slowly. "Someone hurt her." "Yes." Another silence. Then my daughter straightened her back, adjusted her hold on the puppy with absolute steadiness, and said, "Then we have to do something about that too." I looked at her 7 years old, cross-legged on a cabin rug, covered in a thin smear of powdered milk, holding a dying puppy with the calm certainty of someone who has located the correct moral position and intends to stay there, and I thought, there it is again, that thing I don't have the precise word for. What the morning had laid bare was not only a wound or a trap or a criminal operation moving like rot through the root system of these beautiful woods. It was something older and more important. The way we treat those who cannot advocate for themselves, who cannot file a complaint or flag an injustice or even articulate that an injustice has occurred, is not a peripheral measure of character. It is the central one. The husky had come to our door because she had run out of forest and run out of strength and run out of every option except the slim, uncertain hope that a human light in the darkness might mean a human heart behind it. She had trusted us with the most important thing she had, and that trust, I understood now, was not a gift. It was a standard, one we were obligated to meet. Poachers operate in the shadows because they know what they are doing cannot survive the light. They count on silence. They count on people looking away. We refuse to look away, and we hope you do too. If you believe that harming innocent animals for profit is cowardly, subscribe to this channel right now and drop the words "Justice for the Voiceless" in the comments. Let's build a community that refuses to stay quiet. Every comment, every subscription, every share is a light turned on in a place these people were counting on staying dark. The puppy did not have a name yet. Margaret had not given her one, which I understood to be a deliberate act of self-protection, the wordless logic of a child who had already intuited that naming something is an act of commitment, and that commitment, in this particular situation, carried a weight she wasn't certain yet she could bear. So for the first several hours of that long Saturday, the puppy existed in our care as simply her or the baby, or, in the private shorthand Margaret, developed over the course of the morning, a soft sound somewhere between "oh" and "come on" that she made every time the little body went too still for too long. She made that sound often. The puppy was, by any honest assessment, in serious trouble. She was perhaps 2 weeks old, possibly 3, still in that fragile corridor of early life where the body has not yet committed fully to its own survival, where the scales can tip on almost nothing, a drop in temperature, an hour without nutrition, a fever that climbs 2 degrees in the wrong direction. Her eyes were sealed shut. Her ears were folded flat against the small dome of her skull. She could not coordinate her limbs with any purpose, could not generate meaningful warmth on her own, and her attempts to nurse from the spoon Margaret offered were less suckling than the most minimal, barely conscious reflex, the ghost of an instinct flickering in a body that had very little fuel left to run it. The mother husky understood all of this better than we did. She had moved the puppy twice already by the time I returned from the forest, repositioning her closer to the hearth each time the fire dipped, nudging her with a nose so precise it might have been calibrated, never rough, never careless, always exactly the necessary amount of contact and warmth. She catalogued every fluctuation in the puppy's state with a vigilance that had no off switch, no rest cycle. Even when she slept, which she did in short intervals with her chin resting on the rug beside the puppy's blanketed form, one eye opened fully at any change in sound or movement. Motherhood in its most elemental expression, stripped of everything except the watching and the waiting and the refusal to stop. Margaret had taken her cue entirely from the dog. She had established a routine by mid-morning with the quiet authority of someone who has decided that a system is necessary and has gone ahead and built one. Every 45 minutes, she warmed a small amount of diluted milk in a cup set in a bowl of hot water, tested the temperature on her wrist the way she had seen done in some half-remembered context she couldn't even name, and then settled cross-legged on the rug with the puppy cradled in the bowl of her lap, and attempted, with painstaking patience, to introduce the liquid one drop at a time. The challenge was the swallowing. The puppy's reflex was there. We could see the faint movement in her throat when the warm liquid touched the right place, but it was intermittent and unpredictable, firing when it chose to rather than when Margaret needed it to. I had found a soft-tipped dropper in the first aid kit, which helped with control, but it required a steadiness of hand and a tolerance for incremental progress that would have defeated most adults I know within the first hour. Margaret did not waver. She simply sat there session after session and worked the problem the way water works stone, not with force but with consistency, with the understanding that results were not the measure of any single attempt, but of all the attempts accumulated. When the puppy swallowed, she was quiet and steady and moved immediately to the next drop. When the puppy didn't, she waited, adjusted, and tried again. She did not celebrate extravagantly or despair visibly. She simply continued. I made soup and brought her a bowl around noon. She ate it one-handed without taking her eyes off the puppy. I had been on the phone through the morning with 2 people, the Regional Wildlife Authority, who had taken my photographs and GPS coordinates with a seriousness in their voice that told me they already had some idea what they were looking at, and a veterinarian 4 towns over named Dr. Aldrich, who walked me through a more complete care protocol over the phone with the patient precision of someone accustomed to field emergencies. He confirmed what I had intuited about the milk dilution, recommended we add a small amount of glucose to the mixture for immediate energy, and gave me a list of warning signs to watch for: labored breathing, blue tint to the gums, body temperature that would not stabilize upward. The first 12 hours are the heaviest, he said. If she's still with you by tonight and taking fluid with any regularity, your odds improve considerably. I relayed all of this to Margaret in the plainest terms I could manage without varnishing the truth. She listened, asked 2 clarifying questions: what does blue gums look like, and how do I check her temperature, and then turned back to the puppy and made the adjustment to the glucose mixture without drama. The afternoon wore on in that slow, firelit way of ours that are fully occupied. Outside, the forest moved through its own quiet rhythms, wind through the upper canopy, a pair of jays disputing territory somewhere past the tree line, the periodic soft percussion of pine cones dropping onto the cabin roof. Inside, the world had narrowed to a rug in front of a fire, and the breath count of a very small animal fighting its way toward morning. Around 3 o'clock, something shifted. I noticed it first in the mother dog, who had been dozing in her light, vigilant way beside Margaret. She raised her head and turned it toward the puppy with an attention that was different from her usual monitoring, sharper, more specific, the way an instrument responds to a frequency it has been calibrated to detect. Then Margaret made the sound, that soft, involuntary "oh," and I crossed the room quickly. The puppy was moving, not the random, uncoordinated twitching of earlier, but something more intentional, her head turning slowly toward the dropper, her mouth working with a new and unmistakable urgency. She was rooting. The reflex that had been barely a whisper all day had found its voice, and now she was turning toward the warmth of the dropper with the blind, single-minded need of a creature that has decided it intends to stay. Margaret's hands were perfectly still. She kept the dropper in position and let the puppy come to it, and when the little mouth closed around the tip and she felt the pull, a real pull, sustained and intentional, she exhaled so slowly it was almost soundless. The mother dog pressed her nose to the puppy's back, gentle as a benediction. And my daughter, who had been sitting on that rug for the better part of 8 hours, who had not complained or wavered or suggested we try something easier, finally allowed herself a smile so private and so full it seemed to light the room from a different source than the fire. She looked up at me. "She's hungry," she said, as though this were the most ordinary and wonderful thing. "Yeah," I said, "she is." That was the turning point. Not a dramatic reversal, not a sudden restoration of full health. The puppy still had days of fragile, guarded recovery ahead of her, and we all understood that. But hunger is the body's first declaration of intent. It is the organism announcing, however quietly, that it has chosen. And that small choosing, that microscopic act of will from a creature that could not yet open its eyes or lift its own head, was one of the most profound things I had witnessed in a long time. I have thought about it many times since, about Margaret on that rug, hour after hour, not because anyone was watching or because a reward was coming, but simply because the puppy needed someone with patience enough to wait for her. The great wounds of life, the injuries that run deepest, in animals and in people alike, do not respond to urgency or force or the anxious need for fast results. They respond to presence. To the willingness to sit with something broken and believe, without the guarantee of evidence, that it can mend. Patience is not passive. It is one of the most active and demanding forms of love there is. And on that Saturday afternoon in a forest cabin, my 7-year-old daughter demonstrated it better than anyone I have ever known. By Sunday morning, the puppy had a name. Margaret had given it to her somewhere in the small hours, in that private, unwitnessed way that children make their most important decisions, not announced, but simply arrived at, fully formed, as though it had always been true and only needed to be said aloud to become official. She told me over breakfast, matter-of-factly, while the puppy nursed from the dropper with the now reliable vigor that had transformed the entire atmosphere of the cabin from a vigil into something closer to a celebration. "Her name is Ember," Margaret said, "because she was almost out and then she wasn't." I looked at my daughter across the table and thought, not for the first time that weekend, that 7 years old was a deeply underestimated age. The husky had no name from us. She carried herself with a self-possession that made naming her feel presumptuous, like trying to rename a river. Margaret simply called her Mama, which was accurate and sufficient, and which the dog seemed to accept with the mild dignity she brought to most things. Mama's paw was responding well to the treatment. The inflammation had reduced overnight, the wound edges looked cleaner in the morning light, and she was bearing partial weight on the leg again by the time I brought her a bowl of the broth I had simmered from the last of our provisions. She ate with focus, and without the worrying deliberateness of the first night. She ate like an animal rebuilding, which was exactly what she was doing. It was watching Mama move through the cabin that morning, tracking the dog's careful, still favoring gait as she shifted between the fireside and the window and back, that made something connect in my mind with a quiet, definitive click. She had come from a specific direction. I had followed her trail into the forest the previous morning and found the trap line, but I had turned back after the third trap because I had enough evidence, and because I had not wanted to leave Margaret alone for too long. What I had not yet done was follow the line to its end. Trap operations are not random distributions, they are routes, designed and managed like any other infrastructure, with a logic of access and retrieval that, if you could read it, would tell you exactly where the people running it came from and where they intended to go. The trap line I had found ran parallel to the creek bed. Creek beds, in this terrain, ran toward roads. And roads led to people with vehicles and storage, and the cold commercial apparatus of an operation that had been running long enough to invest in professional equipment. I needed to go back out further this time. The question was Margaret. I found her on the rug, Ember warm and milk-fed in her lap, Mama pressed against her left side in the easy, habitual way the dog had already adopted, as though this child's proximity were a resource she intended to maintain. Margaret was talking to the puppy in a low, running monologue that covered, in the 10 seconds I stood listening, the topics of what Ember might look like when her eyes finally opened, whether she would prefer the forest or the cabin once she was strong enough to have an opinion, and the general philosophical question of whether dogs dreamed about the same things they thought about when awake. I told her what I was planning. I did not package it or soften it, because Margaret had demonstrated comprehensively over the past 36 hours that she responded better to plain information than to managed versions of it. She looked up at me. I want to come. I started to form the shape of a reasonable objection, and she moved through it before I could deploy it. I'll stay right next to you. I won't touch anything. And you need someone to hold the phone for photographs because you said your hands were cold and you kept getting blurry ones. Both of these things were true. I looked at her for a moment, then at Mama, who had turned her head toward me with that calibrated attention she brought to anything that seemed to involve a decision about her circumstances. Then I looked back at my daughter. Boots, warm jacket, and you hold my hand across any uneven ground, I said, and the moment I tell you to stop, you stop. No questions, no negotiation. Agreed, she said immediately, which told me she had already known the answer before she asked the question. We left Ember nested in a warm blanket close to the banked fire, checked the window latch, and stepped out into a morning that had turned bright and cold overnight. The sky above the treeline, a hard, clear blue with no weather in it. The forest floor was soft underfoot, still holding the weekend's moisture, and the tracks I had followed the day before were largely intact. Mama's asymmetrical stride pressed into the mud in a legible line that curved northwest into the trees before bending to follow the creek. Margaret walked beside me with the serious, observant quiet of someone who has been told this is important and has decided to treat it accordingly. She watched the ground the way I had taught her to watch it, not looking at one spot, but letting her vision go soft and wide, reading the general texture of the terrain for anomalies rather than hunting specific details. It is an old woodsman's habit, and she had taken to it naturally in previous walks, but today she applied it with a concentration I hadn't seen from her before. She found the fourth trap before I did. She stopped walking, put her hand out to stop me without touching the find, and said quietly, "There, under the fern, see where the leaves look too flat, something heavy is sitting on them from underneath." I crouched and looked. She was right. The trap was set beneath a carefully arranged scatter of vegetation, the ground around it pressed down with the faint regularity of someone who had taken time with the concealment. I photographed it from multiple angles, added the coordinates to the growing file on my phone, and we moved on. The fifth and sixth traps appeared within the next 100 meters, and by the sixth, the picture they collectively painted had taken on a shape that tightened something in my gut. These were not placed to catch animals incidentally. The positioning was too specific, too informed by knowledge of movement patterns and water access and the natural corridors that animals use habitually. Whoever had laid this line had scouted the terrain thoroughly before they touched a trap. They knew this forest the way people know it when they've spent time in it, not as visitors, but as operators. Then, through a break in the trees, I saw the structure. It was set back from the creek by perhaps 30 meters, half swallowed by young growth that had been allowed to advance around it strategically, enough cover to render it functionally invisible from any casual angle, but positioned with a clear sightline to the trap line and accessible from a rough track that came in from the west. It was a storage lean-to, crude but functional, built from weathered timber with a corrugated metal roof. The door was secured with a padlock, but the gap beneath it and the ventilation slots along the upper wall told me enough. The smell that reached us, even from a distance, even diluted by open air and pine and morning, was the smell of confinement, the low, compressed odor of animals held in small spaces. Margaret had gone very still beside me. "Are there animals in there?" she asked. "I think so," I said. She turned and looked up at me, and her expression had moved past the shock of the discovery into something more settled and more determined. It was the same look she had worn on the rug with the dropper, the look that meant she had assessed the situation, identified what it required, and was prepared to provide it. "Then we need to get them out," she said. "We will," I said, "but not us, not today, not without the right people." She absorbed this and nodded, one short, deliberate movement. She understood the difference between courage and recklessness, even at 7, understood that the goal was not the satisfaction of immediate action, but the outcome at the end of the correct process. I took extensive photographs of the structure, the approach track, the surrounding terrain, the trap placement in relation to the lean-to, the fresh tire marks in the soft mud of the access track that told me someone had been here recently and would almost certainly be back. Then I took her hand, and we walked back to the cabin through the brightening morning, the creek murmuring alongside us, the forest doing what forests do, utterly indifferent and completely unaware that two people, one of them not yet tall enough to reach the cabin's top coat hook, had just quietly decided to dismantle what was being done to it. There is a particular kind of guardianship that does not announce itself. It does not require a title or a uniform or a formal mandate. It requires only the willingness to see clearly, to document honestly, and to refuse the convenient logic that what happens to the voiceless is not your concern. The forest had not asked for our protection. The animals in it had no way to request intervention. But standing is not contingent on being asked. Some things simply need to be stood for, and the standing itself becomes the beginning of the answer. That morning, moving through the pines with my daughter's hand in mine, and the evidence of cruelty catalogued carefully on my phone, I felt the quiet, weighty satisfaction of people who have located the right side of something and chosen to stay on it. The call I made to Officer Dara Whitfield at the Regional Wildlife Enforcement Division lasted 47 minutes. I know because Margaret timed it on the kitchen clock, keeping herself occupied during the adult conversation by feeding Ember her midday meal with the focused precision that had become her signature contribution to the household's new purpose. I know because 47 minutes is a long time to be on the phone, and every minute of it mattered in ways that would only become fully apparent later. Whitfield was not the first person I had reached when I initially dialed the Wildlife Authority line that morning. The first was a general intake officer who took my information with professional courtesy and promised follow-up within 48 hours in a tone that suggested 48 hours was an optimistic estimate. I thanked him and hung up, and then did what anyone does when the standard channel feels insufficient to the urgency of the situation. I started making other calls. A contact from a conservation group whose number I had held in my phone for 2 years without using it. A friend from my working years who now sat on a regional land management board. And through him, eventually, Dara Whitfield, who picked up on the second ring and listened to everything I said without interrupting once. That quality, the listening without interruption, told me something important before she had spoken a single word in response. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to take you seriously, but the silence of someone who has already decided and is now organizing what comes next. "How many traps total?" she asked. 6 confirmed, possibly more further along the line. I didn't reach the end of it. The structure, corrugated roof, padlocked door, accessible from a western track. Can you send me the coordinates? Already have them. Check your messages. Another brief silence, this one with a different texture. Mr. Logan, she said, and the shift in her register was subtle but legible, a slight reduction in procedural distance, a move toward directness. I want you to know that what you've documented this morning is consistent with an operation we have been attempting to locate for the better part of 8 months. We've had evidence of systematic trapping in this forest corridor, animal remains, secondary indicators, reports from 2 other landowners, but no confirmed fixed location. What you've found may be the anchor point we've been looking for. I sat with that for a moment. 8 months. This operation had been running, expanding, harvesting the forest's wildlife for the better part of a year, while the trees stood indifferent and the animals navigated around the hazards the way living things do, adapting their routes, losing their numbers, absorbing the losses into the general silence of a wilderness that has no mechanism for complaint. There are animals in that structure, I said. Alive, I could smell it. I know, she said. We're going to move quickly. I need you to do 3 things for me and not do 1 thing. The 3 things were, stay away from the lean-to, share all photographs and coordinates through the secure link she would text me within the hour, and write down everything I could recall about the tire tracks, tread pattern, width estimation, anything that spoke to the vehicle type. The 1 thing was, do not speak about any of this to anyone outside my immediate household until she gave me clearance. I agreed to all 4 without hesitation. When I came off the phone, Margaret was watching me from the rug with Ember asleep, in the warm bracket of her crossed legs and Mama's head resting in her lap with a trusting heaviness that still struck me, every time I saw it, as something close to miraculous. The dog's pale eyes were on me, and I had the familiar sensation of being assessed by an intelligence that communicated in registers I could feel, but not quite articulate. What did she say? Margaret asked. I sat down on the hearth across from her and told her everything in plain language, without the softening adjustments I might once have instinctively applied to information delivered to a child. Margaret had moved well past the point where that kind of protection was either necessary or respectful. She listened with her characteristic still attention, her hand resting lightly on Mama's neck, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment in a way that I recognized. It was the same pause she made before she said something she had thought about carefully. So other people knew something was wrong, she said slowly, but they didn't know where, and we found where. So now everyone who already knew can actually do something. That's exactly right. She nodded. That's how it's supposed to work, isn't it? Everyone does the part they can do. I looked at my daughter, at the dog whose head lay in her lap, at the sleeping puppy whose name meant the fire that doesn't go out. Yes, I said, that's exactly how it's supposed to work. What happened over the following 24 hours had the particular quality of a system activating, the way separate components that have been sitting in readiness suddenly find their connection point and begin to function as a whole. Whitfield's team moved with a speed and coordination that reflected 8 months of preparation, suddenly given a location to attach itself to. By early Sunday afternoon, 2 field officers had made a discreet pass along the western access track in an unmarked vehicle and confirmed the lean-to's location and condition. By evening, Whitfield had consulted with a prosecutor who had been building a broader case involving wildlife trafficking in the region, and our evidence had been formally incorporated into an operation that was considerably larger and more structured than I had initially understood. It was the photographs of Mama's wound that became the center of it. Whitfield called me back late Sunday to tell me that the injury documentation, the wound pattern, the photographs I had taken during treatment, the veterinary confirmation from Dr. Aldrich that the damage was consistent with a specific trap model, provided something that months of environmental evidence and secondary indicators had not been able to supply: direct physical proof of harm to a living animal, with a clear forensic link to the trap type and placement. In legal terms, it shifted the nature of the case. In human terms, it meant that Mama, this battered, extraordinary mother who had crossed the impossible distance between her world and mine on nothing but love and desperation, had walked through our door not only to save her puppy, but without knowing it, to provide the key piece of evidence that would bring down the people who had hurt her. She was lying by the fire when Whitfield told me this, her bandaged paw extended, her eyes half closed in the drowsy contentment of an animal that has eaten well and rested in warmth and safety and begun, cautiously, to believe that the worst of things might be behind her. I looked at her and felt the full weight of what she had accomplished simply by surviving, simply by refusing to stop, simply by trusting the light in a window. Margaret, who had been listening from her habitual position on the rug, processed this information in her particular way and then said, "She's a witness." "In a manner of speaking," I said. "No," Margaret said, with a quiet firmness that reminded me, not for the first time, of no one so much as her mother. "Not in a manner of speaking. She is a witness. She knows what they did. She just needed someone who could speak for her." I did not have anything to add to that. It was entirely correct, and it was also something larger than correct. It was the moral architecture of the entire situation laid out in one sentence by someone who had not yet learned to make simple things complicated. The investigation that Mama's wound anchored, the operation that Margaret's observations in the forest had helped to complete, the case that was now moving through its proper channels toward an outcome that 8 months of work had not been able to reach alone. None of it would have been possible if each part had tried to operate in isolation. The conservation officers needed our evidence. Our evidence needed their infrastructure. The prosecutor needed their field documentation. The whole required every piece, and every piece was diminished without the whole. Injustice of the systematic kind, the kind that builds itself into the landscape quietly over months and years, that counts on operating below the threshold of any single person's attention, does not yield to individual outrage, however justified. It yields to coordination. To the willingness of separate people to do their distinct, specific part, and then connect it to someone else's distinct, specific part, until the accumulated weight of all those contributions becomes something the structure cannot hold against. Margaret had read a tire track. I had made a phone call. Whitfield had maintained 8 months of careful preparation. A prosecutor had built a broader framework. And Mama had done the most important thing of all. She had refused to disappear quietly into the forest and let what had been done to her go unreported. Every one of those contributions had been necessary. Not one of them had been sufficient alone. These poachers built their operation on the belief that nobody was watching, that the animals they trapped had no advocates, and that the forest's silence was the same as permission. They were wrong. Would you have walked past that scratching at the door, or would you have opened it? Would you have let a stranger suffer, or would you have stood up? If you believe that every living creature deserves protection and that cruelty should never go unanswered, hit the like button right now and leave the words, "I stand for kindness," in the comments. Let's make sure these poachers, and every operation like theirs, understands that the world is watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that one person, in the right moment, can change everything. Whitfield called Monday morning at 7:43 with the particular briskness of someone who had not slept much and had made peace with that fact some hours ago. "They'll come back Wednesday," she said without preamble. "We've confirmed the vehicle. It's been logged twice on the forestry access road in the past 3 weeks, always midweek, always early morning. The operation runs on a collection schedule. They set, they wait, they retrieve. Wednesday is the next retrieval window based on the pattern." I was standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee, watching through the window as the forest held its morning stillness. "What do you need from us?" "Cooperation and restraint in that order," she said. "My team will be positioned from Tuesday night. We'll use the access track from the eastern approach so there's no vehicle movement on the western side that could spook them. What I need from you is ordinary. Lights in the cabin at normal hours, smoke from the chimney, the appearance of a family on a weekend stay who have noticed nothing and are doing nothing. Can you do that?" "Yes." A pause. "Mr. Logan, the cabin puts you closer to the operational perimeter than I would prefer. I want to be direct about that. If at any point my team signals a change in circumstances, I need you to take your daughter to the back room, stay low, and wait for my all clear. These are not people who respond well to unexpected variables. I looked across the cabin to where Margaret was still asleep on the fold-out. Ember tucked against her sternum, Mama curled in a crescent around both of them with the proprietary ease of an animal who has decided that these two humans are now within the boundary of what she protects. The image was so complete, so quietly perfect in its arrangement of the things I loved and the things that had come to matter with sudden velocity over the past 72 hours, that looking at it, while Whitfield spoke about operational perimeters and unexpected variables, produced a particular quality of fear. Not the sharp, reactive kind, but the slow, deep variety that comes from understanding exactly what you are responsible for. Understood, I said. The Monday that followed was the strangest day of the entire week because it was required to look like nothing. We could not go back into the forest. We could not make unusual calls or receive unusual visitors. We were to be, in every observable way, a father and daughter on an extended weekend who had found 2 dogs and were nursing them back to health and had no larger concerns than that. The performance of normalcy, it turned out, is far more demanding than it sounds when what you are performing it over is anything but. Margaret adapted to this constraint with a flexibility that impressed me. When I explained what Whitfield had asked of us, the waiting, the appearing ordinary, the specific geography of what we were not to do, she listened, asked one question about whether the animals in the lean-to would be all right for 2 more days, received my honest answer that Whitfield's team would be monitoring the site, and then went back to Ember with the same deliberate investment she had maintained since Saturday. She did not perform distress about the waiting. She simply redirected her energy toward what was directly in front of her, which was the continuing work of keeping a small life on the right side of the line. But I watched her through that day, and I saw the effort underneath the composure. There were moments when she would stop in the middle of something, mid-sentence, mid-movement, mid-feeding session with the dropper, and go very still with a particular expression that I recognized as the face she made when something was occupying more of her internal space than she wanted to show. She was thinking about the lean-to, about the animals inside it, about the fact that she knew where they were and could not go to them, and had to trust a process she could not see or verify to unfold on a timeline she had no control over. She was 7 years old, and she was practicing one of the hardest disciplines that human beings ever develop, the discipline of acting only within your lane when what you want most is to act everywhere at once. Mama felt the change in the cabin's atmosphere long before I would have credited an animal with the sensitivity to do so. She had been recovering well, the paw bearing more weight each day, her appetite strong, her energy returning in increments that were visible if you were paying attention. But on Monday she was different. She moved through the cabin with a restlessness that she had not shown since the first night, returning repeatedly to the front door, standing at it for minutes at a time with her nose working at the gap beneath it and her ears rotating independently in the way that dogs process directional sound. She wasn't distressed in the way of an animal reacting to a threat. She was alert in the way of an animal who knows that something is coming and is positioning herself accordingly. I found myself watching her the way I had watched her from the chair on the first night, reading her the way you read any reliable instrument, and what she was telling me, in the language of posture and attention and the precise angle of her nose, was that the forest outside held something that had not been there before. Whitfield's team settling into their positions, the machinery of consequence arranging itself in the dark beyond the tree line. Mama knew, I was certain of it, and she had placed herself between the door and the rug where Margaret and Ember slept, not with aggression, but with the quiet, unambiguous intentionality of a guardian who has selected her post. Tuesday passed in the same disciplined suspension. I cooked real meals, the kind that required time and attention, and kept my hands occupied. Margaret read to Ember in the low, even voice she had developed for the purpose, a kind of narrated world-building for a puppy who could now track sound with visible interest, her small ears swiveling toward Margaret's voice with an alertness that was new and that made Margaret smile in the private way she reserved for Ember's milestones. I added logs to the fire at regular intervals. Smoke rose from the chimney at ordinary hours, a father and daughter on a late weekend, nothing more. But underneath the performance, something was consolidating in both of us. I have thought carefully in the time since about what it actually takes to hold a position when every instinct is pushing you toward action. There is a version of bravery that the world tends to celebrate most visibly, the kind that involves movement, confrontation, the dramatic forward gesture. It is real and it matters. But there is another kind that receives less attention and requires, I think, equal or greater resolve, the bravery of holding still when stillness is what the situation needs. Of trusting a process you cannot supervise. Of staying within your lane not because you don't care, but because you understand that caring is not the same as controlling, and that the outcome you want most is best served by the discipline of doing only what is yours to do. Margaret demonstrated this on Tuesday evening in a way that has stayed with me. Ember had been awake and restless, more vigorous than any previous evening, her growing strength expressing itself as a refusal to stay settled, her small legs pushing against the blanket with new purposefulness. Margaret had been managing this with patient repositioning for the better part of an hour when she finally looked up at me with an expression that was tired and a little overwhelmed and entirely honest. "I keep wanting to go out there," she said quietly, "to the lean-to. I know I can't, but I keep wanting to." "I know," I said, "so do I." She looked down at Ember, who had finally settled into the warm curve of her palm. "Is this what it feels like to be brave? Because it doesn't feel brave, it just feels hard." I sat down beside her on the rug. Mama shifted and resettled against my back, her warmth substantial and steady. "I think that might be exactly what brave feels like," I said, "most of the time." She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. "Then I think brave is different than I thought it was." "How did you think it was?" "I thought it meant not being scared." She looked at Ember again. "But I'm scared, and I'm still here, and I'm still doing what I'm supposed to do, so maybe that's it." I put my arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into me without making a production of it. Mama's breathing behind us was slow and even. Ember slept. The fire settled. Outside, in a forest we were trusting to others tonight, the careful, necessary work of justice was positioning itself for morning. Comfort zones are not the measure of a person's commitment. They are simply the boundary between the familiar and the required, and when something matters enough, the required has a way of expanding what you believed you were capable of. Every person in that forest on Tuesday night, in their distinct and specific capacity, had moved past the edge of what was comfortable and stayed there anyway. Whitfield's officers in the cold dark, Margaret on the rug, holding still. Mama at her post by the door, watching the threshold she had crossed once in desperation and would, if asked, cross again without hesitation. Protecting something is not always possible from a safe distance. Sometimes it asks you to stand somewhere that frightens you and to stand there anyway, and to stay standing until the thing you are protecting no longer needs you to. Wednesday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, quietly, without the fanfare that retrospect tends to assign them. The sky was the same pale gray it had been all week. The pines stood in their usual indifferent rows, and the creek murmured along its channel with the complete disinterest of water that has witnessed everything and retained nothing. Inside the cabin, Ember woke Margaret at 6 by nosing at her chin with a persistence that had replaced the dropper as the primary delivery mechanism of their morning relationship. And Margaret's laugh, startled and genuine and still half asleep, was the first sound of a day that would become one I would carry for the rest of my life. I had slept badly, not from fear exactly, but from the particular wakefulness of someone who knows that a clock is running on something important and cannot turn their mind away from the counting. I had risen twice in the night to add wood to the fire, and both times had stood for a moment in the dark cabin listening to the forest outside, with an attention that the forest returned with perfect neutrality. Somewhere out there, Whitfield's team was in position. I knew this the way you know things that you cannot verify, through the logic of a person you have decided to trust, having told you it would be so. Mama knew it differently. She had spent the night at the door with only brief intervals of rest, and by morning her alertness had shifted into something more concentrated, not the restless monitoring of the previous 2 days, but a focused, directional attention that reminded me of the way a compass needle behaves when it has found its north. She was not anxious, she was ready. There is a meaningful difference between those two states, and the dog embodied it with a precision that no amount of training produces. It comes only from experience, from having already survived the thing that is coming, and from understanding in the cellular, unambiguous way of living creatures that survival is not passive. I made breakfast with careful normalcy. Eggs, toast, the last of the coffee. Margaret sat at the table with Ember in a blanketed box beside her chair. We had graduated from lap carrying to a contained space as the puppy's mobility increased, a development that Margaret had greeted with the mixture of pride and mild anxiety of a parent whose child has learned to walk, and ate with the focused efficiency of someone conserving energy for an unspecified later requirement. We did not talk about what day it was. We talked about Ember's eyes, which were beginning to show the first faint, promising seam of light along their sealed edges, the biological promise of opening held just a day or two further along the timeline. At 8:15, my phone vibrated on the table between us. A single message from Whitfield, 2 words, "They're here." I looked at Margaret. She looked at my phone and then at me. I turned the screen so she could read it. She nodded once, that short, deliberate movement that had become her signature acknowledgement of serious information, and then reached down and placed her hand on the side of Ember's box, a gesture that was partly comfort and partly, I thought, the physical expression of everything she intended to protect. "Back room," I said. She picked up the box and went without a word. I moved Mama gently but firmly away from the front door. She resisted for exactly 1 moment, her body taut with the desire to be on the other side of it, before she accepted my redirection with the trust that still caught me somewhere in the chest every time she extended it, and brought her with us to the back bedroom, the one furthest from the western tree line, where I settled Margaret on the bed with Ember's box beside her and Mama pressed against her knee like a warm, breathing wall. "Stay here," I said. "Don't move until I come for you." "I know," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were steady. I closed the bedroom door and stood in the hallway with my heart conducting itself at a volume I was grateful only I could hear. What happened in the forest over the following hour reached me in fragments, the way significant events always reach people who are adjacent to them rather than inside them. Sound first, then information, then the larger picture assembled from parts. The sound was less than I had expected and more concentrated. At 8:43, from somewhere in the mid-distance beyond the western tree line, I heard 2 short bursts of noise that my mind categorized before I could consciously process them, the flat, authoritative crack of vehicle doors, then voices, the kind that carry the specific register of commands issued by people with the standing to issue them. Then a period of relative silence, during which I stood in the hallway and breathed at deliberate intervals and did not move. Then Whitfield's number on my phone. "We have them," she said. Her voice carried the controlled satisfaction of someone who has been waiting 8 months for a sentence and is being careful not to spend it too quickly. 3 individuals, 2 are known to us. They've been on our radar in connection with wildlife trafficking across 2 counties. The third is new and frankly more significant. He's the distribution link, the piece we didn't have. I exhaled against the hallway wall. The animals in the structure. Alive, all of them. She paused, and in the pause I heard something that the professional surface of her voice had been carefully containing. "It's worse than we anticipated in terms of numbers, but they're alive, and my team is with them now. We'll have wildlife rehabilitation on site within the hour." "How many?" 11 animals, various species, 3 of them in urgent need of veterinary attention. Another pause. "Mr. Logan, what you documented, the trap line, the coordinates, the wound evidence, it gave us the legal threshold we needed to move decisively rather than continuing to surveil. Every animal in that structure is alive today in part because of what your family did this weekend." I stood in the hallway of our forest cabin and looked at the closed bedroom door and thought about what was on the other side of it, my daughter, a recovering husky, a puppy with a name that meant fire that persists, and felt the particular, overwhelming quality of a moment that is too large to absorb in real time and will take years to fully understand. I opened the bedroom door. Margaret looked up at me from the bed. Mama raised her head. Ember was awake in her box, making the small, insistent sounds that meant she was ready for her morning feeding. "They got them," I said. Margaret's expression moved through several things quickly before it settled: relief and something harder to name, a complex emotional resolution that looked less like simple happiness than like the satisfaction of a person who has seen a thing through to its correct conclusion. Then she reached into Ember's box and lifted the puppy to her chest and held her with a gentleness that was also, somehow, triumphant. "Good," she said quietly, "good." In the days that followed, as the case moved through its formal channels and the details became available to us in the careful, measured way that active investigations release information, the picture that assembled itself was bleaker and more extensive than anything I had imagined, standing over the first trap with cold hands and a phone camera. The operation had been running for 11 months. It had involved the systematic trapping of wolves, foxes, and various birds of prey, whose pelts and parts fed into a distribution network that crossed regional boundaries and connected to buyers operating well beyond the forest's geography. The 3 men arrested on Wednesday morning had processed and sold wildlife, representing what prosecutors would later describe as a significant and sustained assault on the local ecosystem. A clinical phrase that meant, in its human translation, that they had done an enormous amount of harm to a great number of living things, for money, while counting entirely on the silence of the wilderness to protect them. The silence had been broken by a husky who scratched at a cabin door. I thought about that often in the weeks that followed the arrest, about the extraordinary chain of contingency that connects cause to consequence across the distances that justice must sometimes travel. Those 3 men had operated for nearly a year under the assumption that what happened in the forest stayed in the forest, that the darkness was their accomplice, that the inability of their victims to file complaints was the same as immunity. They had been wrong not because a sophisticated enforcement operation had found them, though one eventually had. They had been wrong because a mother had loved her puppy enough to drag herself on 3 legs through miles of cold forest, and a child had held out her hand in a doorway, and a father had followed a wound back to its source, and an officer had answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting. The chain required every link. Remove any one of them, and the 11 animals in that structure remain where they were. Wickedness of this kind, systematic, profit-driven, armored by the assumption of invisibility, has a genuine and foundational vulnerability. It is built on darkness as a structural requirement, not metaphorical darkness, but the practical, operational dependence on no one looking, no one following, no one connecting the injury to its instrument and the instrument to its owner. It cannot survive scrutiny. It cannot survive documentation. It absolutely cannot survive the combination of a child who notices that leaves look too flat over hidden metal and an adult who understands that noticing is only the beginning of the obligation. The moment the light finds it, even one small, specific, carefully aimed beam of it, the architecture begins to fail. These men had believed they were untouchable. They had confused the silence of their victims with permission and the remoteness of their operation with safety. Wednesday morning had corrected both assumptions with the irreversible efficiency of a legal process that, for all its slowness, has a very long memory and no interest in the comfort of those it is coming for. These men built their livelihood on the suffering of creatures who had no voice to resist them and no mechanism to report what was being done. They believed that made them safe. They were wrong. Do you think the punishment they received was sufficient, or do you believe the law should hold wildlife criminals to a higher standard of consequence? Tell us what you think in the comments. This is a community that refuses to let cruelty go unexamined, and your voice matters here. And if this story has moved you, if you believe that evil exposed is evil diminished, please share it. Subscribe if you haven't. The more of us who are watching, the smaller the darkness becomes. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came the way most true things come, incrementally, almost argumentatively, taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back until the cold finally conceded the argument and retreated into the higher elevations where it would wait with the patience of something that knows its season will return. The snow that had threatened through February loosened its grip through March in stages. First, the icicles along the cabin's eave began their slow drip at midday. Then the creek swelled with meltwater and changed its voice from a murmur to something more declarative. And then one morning in the first week of April, the birds returned to the tree line in numbers, and the forest filled with a sound that had been absent long enough that hearing it again felt like a kind of restoration. We had come back to the cabin 4 times since the arrest. The first time was at the end of that same week, when the wildlife rehabilitation team had cleared the site and Whitfield had given us the access we had been waiting for. The lean-to had been dismantled, the trap line removed, the access track blocked with forestry barriers that would require deliberate effort to circumvent. What the poachers had built over 11 months had been taken apart in 48 hours, which felt both insufficient and exactly right. Insufficient as a measure of the harm done, exactly right as a demonstration of how quickly the infrastructure of cruelty collapses when it is no longer being actively maintained. The subsequent visits had been for Mama and Ember. Dr. Aldrich had been clear from the beginning and had remained consistent in his clarity through each follow-up examination that the goal of the rehabilitation was reintegration. Mama was a husky, but she was not domesticated in the way the word is usually meant. She had no microchip, no registration, no history that connected her to any human household. The working theory, supported by her behavior and confirmed by the Regional Animal Welfare Assessment, was that she was part of a semi-wild population that ranged across the forest corridor, loosely descended from working sled dogs that had been released or had wandered beyond their operational territory over successive generations. She was accustomed to human proximity, but not human dependence. She was, in the most fundamental sense, a forest animal who had visited us because she had needed us, and who would need us less as her healing progressed. Margaret understood this from the first time Dr. Aldrich explained it. I watched her face during that conversation with the careful attention I had developed for reading the expressions she did not always choose to put into words, and what I saw was not the denial or resistance I had half prepared myself to navigate. It was something more mature and more difficult, the face of someone who has understood a painful truth completely and is deciding, with full knowledge of what it costs, to accept it. She did not talk about it much, but she began, quietly and without announcement, to do something that I recognized only in retrospect as deliberate preparation. She started sitting with Mama at greater distances. Instead of the close, constant physical contact of the cabin weeks, the leaning and the hand on neck, and the easy habitual weight of the dog against her side, she began positioning herself across the room or on the porch steps while Mama moved in the yard below, present but not pressing. She was practicing, I understood, practicing the larger space, giving both of them time to accustom themselves to the shape of what was coming. Ember's development through those weeks had been one of the uncomplicated joys of an otherwise complicated period. Her eyes had opened in the 3rd week, fully, suddenly, in the way that developmental milestones tend to arrive, as though the body has been preparing in private and then simply decides it is time. They were pale blue, nearly silver, the exact shade of her mother's in certain lights, and the first time they focused on Margaret's face with visible recognition, the small body orienting toward her, the tail beginning its uncoordinated first attempts at the motion it would later perform with great enthusiasm. Margaret had made the sound she reserved for Ember's milestones, that private, involuntary exhale of wonder, and then had sat very quietly for a moment with her hands in her lap and said nothing at all. By April, Ember was a different creature than the motionless bundle she had been on that first night. She was solid and bright-eyed and moved through whatever space she occupied with the cheerful physical confidence of an animal that has never known its own body to fail it, because by the time she was old enough to know herself, the worst was already over. She nursed independently. She played. She tormented Mama with the specific, joyful relentlessness of a puppy who has discovered that her mother's patience, while considerable, is not infinite. She had begun to follow Mama to the cabin door when Mama stood there looking out, which Dr. Aldrich said was exactly the behavior pattern he expected to see at her developmental stage, the instinct toward the wild expressing itself. The release date was a Saturday in the second week of April, chosen because the weather window was clear and the forest floor had dried enough for confident movement, and because Dr. Aldrich had conducted his final assessment the previous Tuesday and said, with the plain satisfaction of someone who has seen a difficult case resolve well, that both animals were as ready as they were going to get, and that waiting longer would not serve them. Margaret was quiet in the car on the drive up. Not unhappy, I want to be precise about that, because there is a version of this story in which a child's sadness is the emotional center of the ending, and that is not what was true. She was quiet in the way of someone who is fully present inside an experience and does not want to dilute it with words. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the forest move past the window, the fresh green of early spring brilliant against the dark pine trunks, and her expression was the one I had no precise word for, the one that had accumulated new meaning over the months of this story, until it had become something I recognized as her specific face for moments that mattered. We parked where the western access track met the tree line, at a point Dr. Aldrich and Whitfield had jointly selected as appropriate terrain. Within the range, Mama had been observed to inhabit before her injury, close to the creek, with a natural corridor opening northward into the deeper forest where the population she had come from was known to range. I opened the back of the vehicle and both dogs jumped down with the easy physicality of animals in full health, which was still, after months, capable of producing in me a specific gratitude, the sharp, clean variety that comes from remembering clearly what something looked like when it was not this way. Mama's paw had healed without significant lasting impairment. She moved on four legs with the balanced, fluid efficiency she must have had before the trap, and watching her move that way, in that light, on that ground, produced in me a feeling I can only describe as the sensation of a debt being honored. Margaret crouched down and Ember came to her immediately, nose first, the greeting she always led with. Margaret cupped the puppy's face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment, just looked. The way you look at things you are trying to keep. Then she pressed her forehead gently against Ember's and closed her eyes. Mama stood a few meters away, her face toward the forest, her nose reading the air with the deep, unhurried attention of an animal reconnecting with information she had always known. She turned once and looked at Margaret. Margaret opened her eyes and looked back. Something passed between them, the same quality of exchange I had witnessed in the doorway on the first night, the same gravity, the same completeness. A recognition of what had been given and received. Then Mama turned back to the forest, and after a moment, Ember turned too, following her mother's attention with the instinctive alignment of a young animal whose compass is set to the parent. "Okay," Margaret said softly. It was not addressed to me. It was the word of release, not permission exactly, because Mama did not require our permission, had never required it, had come to us on her own terms and was leaving on the same. It was more like an acknowledgement, a spoken completion of a thing that had been, from the very beginning, moving toward this moment. Mama walked into the tree line without hesitation. Ember followed, her small legs finding the uneven ground with surprising confidence, her tail moving continuously. They passed through the first layer of trees, and the forest received them in the way forests receive things that belong to them, without ceremony, without drama, simply closing around them like water closing over a hand. They did not look back. Margaret stood at the tree line for a long time. I stood beside her and did not speak, because there was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying more completely. The creek ran behind us. The birds continued their business in the canopy overhead. The forest held its enormous, indifferent life, and somewhere inside it, two animals that had been at the edge of ending were now moving through the new spring growth toward whatever the forest offered them next. Eventually Margaret exhaled, long, slow, the kind of breath that has been held through an entire chapter of something. She turned and took my hand, which she had not done unprompted since she was much smaller, and we walked back to the vehicle through the soft April light. It is possible to love something completely and to want for it something other than your continued presence. This is not a simple or a natural feeling. It runs against the grain of the instinct that wants to hold, to keep, to maintain proximity to the things that have become precious. But love that cannot release is something other than love at its fullest expression. It is love that has made itself the center of its own story, and the truest love, the kind that Mama had demonstrated from the very beginning, crossing impossible distances for something smaller than herself, is the kind that keeps the beloved at the center, regardless of what that costs. Margaret had understood this, at 7 years old, with a depth of comprehension that most people spend a lifetime working toward. She had loved Ember through the worst of it, and held Mama through the healing of it, and stood at the tree line and said okay, because she understood, in the bone-deep way of people who have genuinely paid attention, that the greatest measure of love is not what you keep, but what you are willing, when the time comes, to set free. 3 years have a way of changing the dimensions of things. The cabin that had felt like a sanctuary when we first began driving up to it, a place defined by its remove from everything consequential, had become something different in the years since that weekend. It had acquired the weight of a place where something real had happened, where choices had been made that mattered beyond the moment of their making. We returned to it the way people return to significant geography, with the particular reverence that belongs not to places themselves, but to the versions of ourselves we became inside them. Margaret was 10 now. The change that 3 years produces in a child is not incremental in the way that the same period alters an adult. It is more like a series of quiet revisions to a document that you look up one day and realize has become something substantively different from the original, without any single edit being dramatic enough to have announced the transformation as it occurred. She was taller, of course, and her face had lost the particular roundedness of early childhood and was settling toward its longer, more defined future form. But the more significant changes were interior and expressed themselves in the quality of her attention, the patience of her reasoning, the way she had of sitting with a question before she answered it that had always been present, but had deepened with practice into something that teachers and other adults in her life tended to remark on as unusual for her age. She still stopped for worms on wet pavement. We had come up for the May long weekend, the same general season as the release 3 years prior, and the forest was in the full extravagance of late spring, the undergrowth lush and diverse in a way that the early April of Mama and Ember's departure had only suggested, the canopy filled in overhead so that the light reaching the forest floor was filtered and dappled and moved continuously with the breeze. The creek was still running strong with the last of the snowmelt from the upper elevations, and the birdsong was the complex, layered kind of May, not the tentative first returns of early spring, but the full chorus of a population that has settled back into its territory and resumed its business with confidence. The cabin itself was unchanged in all the ways that cabins, when properly maintained, resist change. The braided rug was still in front of the fireplace. The wooden chair was still beside it. The supply cabinet still held antiseptic and bandages and antibiotic ointment that I restocked every visit with a thoroughness that had less to do with statistical probability and more to do with what that weekend had taught me about the relationship between preparedness and mercy. We had arrived on Friday evening and spent Saturday the way we had learned to spend days in this place, slowly, without agenda, the forest setting the pace and us following it. Margaret had brought a field notebook, a recent development in her personal equipment that she used to document whatever held her attention on a given walk. Bird species, lichen formations, the geometry of spider webs in morning dew, the evidence of animal movement readable in soft ground. She had become, quietly and without making a project of it, someone who paid attention to the natural world with a specificity that was moving to witness, because I knew its origin and understood what it had cost to come by it. It was Sunday morning when it happened. We had taken the northern trail, the one that curved along the creek, before opening into a wide meadow clearing that Margaret had claimed as her preferred documentation spot on previous visits. The light was exceptional, the kind of clear, clean May light that makes colors more saturated than usual, the greens almost theatrical in their intensity. We walked in comfortable silence, which had become the default register of our time in this forest, both of us having learned that the woods reward the quiet visitor with a generosity they withhold from noise. Margaret stopped first. She put her arm out, the same instinctive gesture I had used with her years ago, but now reversed, her reaching back to stop me, and stood very still on the trail with her eyes fixed on the meadow's edge approximately 30 meters ahead. I stopped and followed her gaze. At the tree line, half in shadow and half in the meadow's light, stood a husky. My heart performed something that was not quite a leap, but was in that direction, a surge of recognition so immediate it bypassed conscious processing entirely. She was at this distance, and in this dappled light recognizable not by any single feature, but by the total composition of her, the silver and black and storm gray coat, the particular way she carried her weight, the quality of her stillness, which was never the blankness of an animal unaware, but always the focused quiet of one that has chosen, for this moment, to watch rather than move. Beside her, pressed to her flank with the casual ease of long habit, was a younger husky. Lean, bright-eyed, her coat a lighter variation on her mother's, silver-white along the chest and face, darkening across the back and shoulders. She was perhaps 2.5 years old. She was, in every observable way, healthy and strong, and entirely at home in the space she occupied. Ember. I have no certainty. I want to be clear about that. I am not a man who fabricates certainties for the comfort of a better story. The forest ranged that far. Similar colorings were not impossible. 3 years had passed, and memory is not a photograph. But I had spent enough time studying both of those animals in close proximity during weeks of concentrated observation to have formed an impression of them that went beyond coloring and markings into something less articulable, but no less real. The way they held themselves, the way they moved, the specific combination of alertness and ease that had distinguished Mama from the first moment she crossed our threshold. It was her, I was as certain as I needed to be. Margaret had not moved. She was standing on the trail with her arm still slightly extended from the gesture that had stopped me, her field notebook hanging forgotten at her side, and her face was the one she had no word for, and neither did I. The face that had accumulated meaning over 3 years, until it had become her specific expression for moments that the ordinary vocabulary of feeling cannot quite contain. The older husky turned her head toward us. It was unhurried, the kind of movement that speaks of an animal that is not afraid, that has assessed the situation and found it familiar at some level that does not require the body's alarm systems to engage. She looked at us with the pale, intelligent eyes that I had not forgotten, could not have forgotten, would not forget, and held the gaze for a long moment. Margaret made a sound, barely audible, barely more than an exhale shaped around the ghost of a name. The younger husky looked up at the sound. She fixed her bright eyes on Margaret with the direct, curious attention of a healthy young animal encountering something interesting, and her tail moved, a slow, considering wag, the kind that is not the reflex of excitement, but the deliberate expression of an animal making an assessment. Then she took 3 steps toward us and stopped, her nose working the air with focused curiosity, closing the distance between the wild and the known to a span that was neither far enough to be indifferent nor close enough to be dependent. Exactly the right distance. Margaret crouched on the trail without making any sudden movement, her hand dropping instinctively to the palm-up position she had learned before she could have articulated why it was correct. She waited, as she had always waited, with the patience that had been her particular gift since the beginning, holding the space open, letting the other being decide. The younger husky stretched her neck forward and sniffed the air in Margaret's direction. A long, thorough reading. Then she pulled back, tilted her head once in the way of dogs that have found something they find genuinely interesting, and turned and walked back to her mother with the easy confidence of an animal that has completed a task to her satisfaction. Mama watched Margaret for another moment. Then she turned, placed her nose briefly against her daughter's ear in the gesture of contact that I had seen her perform 100 times during Ember's puppyhood, the wordless currency of their relationship, and the two of them walked back into the tree line. The forest received them in the way it always had, without ceremony, without drama, simply closing around them as though they had always been there and would be, in the ways that mattered, long after everything else had changed. Margaret stayed crouched on the trail until they were fully gone. Then she stood slowly and turned to me. Her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite not tears, the specific brightness that belongs to the intersection of joy and grief and love and time all arriving in the same moment. She did not say anything for a long while. We stood together on the trail in the May light, the creek running alongside us, the birds conducting their business overhead, the forest enormous and indifferent and full of living things going about the vital work of being alive. Then she opened her field notebook and with the careful precision she brought to documentation, made an entry. I read over her shoulder. May North Meadow Trail. Observed 2 huskies, adult female and young female approximately 2.5 years, in good condition. Both healthy, both wild, both exactly where they should be. She closed the notebook. She remembered, Margaret said. It was not a question. Yes, I said, I think she did. My daughter nodded, and in the nod was the quiet resolution of someone who has seen a thing through from its beginning to a point that is not quite an ending, but is something better. A continuation, a living proof that the original act of mercy had propagated forward through time in ways that no single moment of kindness can predict or control, but that the world, in its complex and unhurried way, tends to honor. I have thought many times about what it means to leave a mark. The culture we inhabit tends to measure impact by scale and visibility, by the size of what is built or the breadth of what is changed, or the number of people who can be demonstrated to have been affected. These are not worthless measures, but they miss something that the forest understands and that Margaret, crouching on a trail in the May light with her palm held open, has always understood. Kindness does not require an audience. It does not require a record or a metric or a visible chain of consequence leading from cause to effect in a straight, legible line. It requires only the willingness to respond in the moment you are given to the thing in front of you that needs responding to. A door opened, a hand extended, a dropper held patient and still through hour after hour of a long Saturday. These things do not end at their own edges. They travel forward through the lives they touch into other lives, and from those into others still, in the expanding, invisible way of all genuine good, never fully traceable, never fully finished, moving through the world long after the person who first set it in motion has forgotten that they did. We walked back to the cabin through the brilliant May morning, and the forest moved around us in the easy, generous way of a place that is, against all evidence and all the cruelty that had once been done inside it, essentially alive and essentially well. The creek ran, the birds sang. Somewhere in the deep green distance, a mother and her daughter moved through the trees in the particular freedom of animals that have never known a cage and will not, because of a scratching at a cabin door, because of a child who held out her hand, because of the ordinary, extraordinary decision to respond with kindness to a stranger's need, ever have to. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything.